As Christians, sometimes we ask ourselves the question about whether or not we should be concerned about problems that are taking place in other parts of the world, conflicts and little wars between ethnic groups, and does it really affect us? Do you think we should be concerned about these conflicts that are taking place around the world, or should we not be interested in them?
Well, there's advantages to being interested and advantages to kind of keeping a distance, and as far as like what our psychology and our spirits can handle, we don't have to know about everything everywhere all the time. But of course, it is, I think, good to be aware of the world we live in, the way people live, and the things that people are facing. We've talked, for example, about these environmental difficulties that we face as a globe, and I think it's important to know that there are some people who are facing the issues of water and food and temperature quite a bit more than we might be.
Yes, I'm reminded of a movie that was well watched in the 60s that Marlon Brando made called The Ugly American. And that was a movie that took place in Southeast Asia. This one small country was in turmoil, and he was an American journalist there, and he wanted to get the message of the problems of this country out to the waiting world. But part of the message of that movie was the Western world didn't want to know about it. I'd rather watch my football game, I'd rather watch my baseball game, or whatever it is or my cricket game. From whence cometh wars? James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3 says, From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence even of your lusts that war in your members? You lust and have not, you kill and desire to have, and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you have not, because you ask not. You ask and receive not, because you ask amiss, that you may consume it upon your lusts. So I think when we talk about wars in different parts of the world, and I think that we should be aware of some of the wars and some of these conflicts that are going on, if only to pray for them, or we could or should get involved if we have the means to, in helping them solve some of these problems. Now, like you said, we can't get involved in all of them, but I think it's at least important that we are aware of some of these things that are going on and not just be concerned about the Sunday football game.
Sure, and I think we see a lot of examples of people being aware of things and therefore being able to do something about them. There's plenty of very godly aid organizations that are doing things in a way that is helping people. And, if people weren't concerned, these kinds of projects wouldn't be happening. So we can pray, we can think about the way we live and about how we can avoid these problems ourselves, and then we also can be a help. As we see, there's a lot of good people doing a lot of great things.
I'd like to mention a few of the conflicts that are going on around the world, but before I do that, and then I'd like to ask your take on them, Peter. I wanted to share a couple verses. The first one here is in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 18, and this is the English Standard Version I'm reading from. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. So I think in sharing what we have can be possibly one solution to some of the problems that we see around the world. And of course, Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, verse 38, Give and it shall be given unto you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use it, it will be measured back to you. So that brings us to the old saying, you get what you pay for, and that if you give good, good will come back to you. But at the very least, we could be praying for them and be aware of them, and possibly find out if there's any missionary work that are going on in any of these places. And if you can't be a missionary, someone once said, then you should support a missionary.
Sure. And unfortunately, with a lot of these conflicts, they lead to mass displacements. Now, how does that affect us? Well, we've seen a lot of the richer countries of the world being having to take in these people. So, sometimes the problems...
Refugees.
Yeah, so sometimes
right.
the problems literally come right to our doorstep, and we have to make a decision. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to help these people? So it's not always a matter of going overseas. Sometimes the problems
come to our doorstep.
To us. Yeah.
Yes, as we see, that's right. On our southern border, right? Especially with the pandemic, some of these economies in these countries that we're going to talk about are very, very fragile, and the pandemic and all that it has brought to the world economy has affected greatly these places. We're going to put some maps on the screen here so you can see where we're talking about. The first one that we'd like to just bring up, and Peter, if you could fill us in on some of this, this is in Ethiopia, in the African country of Ethiopia. About a year ago, Ethiopian federal forces began an assault on the Tigray region. The Tigray region is a small region in the north of Ethiopia, just south of Eritrea. And the violence has killed thousands of people, including many civilians, and displaced more than 1 million internally in the country, 50,000 people fleeing to the Sudan, which is just to the west of the country. Is there anything that we should know about the Ethiopian situation, or to help us to better pray for these people?
Well, it's important to remember, Ethiopia was formed and in some ways continues to be a multi-ethnic empire, ruled from the capital. Actually, it was legally an empire up until the revolution in the 70s. So there are a lot of different peoples who have different ideas about how they want to proceed with their governance and with their lives. And it's really sad sometimes. You see these countries that they become more and more developed. Sometimes you think they're past the point of having something like this happen. But then, like with Ethiopia or Syria or even Mexico with the drug war, you see how even in this super modern age where we have so much convenience, so much modernity, so much communication, we're still susceptible to these ancient problems. Like, who could imagine, living in some modern city that there's going to be a literal battle outside on your street? But for people in some of these countries, that is literally happening, and their ideas about how their lives were going to be and what their society is going to be like go out the window, and it's quite tragic.
Another aspect of the situation in Ethiopia that is interesting is the Nile River. Comes from Ethiopia, and unlike the Euphrates River, which we spoke about in another one of our segments, it doesn't flow from north to south. The Nile flows from south to north, and it flows from Sudan right into Egypt.
About 85% of the Nile's waters come from the highlands of Ethiopia, and they've constructed what's they call the Grand Renaissance Dam, and it could be tremendously beneficial for the people of Ethiopia to have access to all this water for hydroelectric power and boost people's standards of living, raise people out of poverty, increase life expectancy. But we're literally talking about life and death when it comes to the development of some of these poor countries. But
then when they stop that water up, it affects the downflow.
Exactly. So depending on how fast they fill that dam, if they filled it nonstop for 2 or 3 years, that would mean that Sudan and Egypt would lose their water. There goes the Nile. So there's a lot of tension in that country, which has led to large arms purchases and increases in military planning and in military mobilization in that part of Africa over how Ethiopia will now control the waters of the Nile. And we see these countries
could that be in any relation to what's happening with the Euphrates River and play into the end time events, these what could turn into water wars in that part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, interesting you mentioned Euphrates, because it's so much of the same kind of things going on. We have growing populations who want better things in life, and but then the way we live in these countries, and we make governments, and we end up with things like national interest and metrics like GDP and things that don't really stand for compassion and sharing and a lot of the principles that we see
Christian
in the Bible.
values. Yes.
Yeah.
I would like to just talk about one region in northern Africa, which is having a lot of conflict and problems right now, and we'll just highlight that for a minute. And that is the crisis that is engulfing the Sahel region in North Africa, which is actually in the country of Mali, and since the beginning of 2020, the interethnic violence there has been increasing between the jihadists and some of the people, the nomads that are living in there. Could you tell us what that, and we'll put the map up there so you can see where that is, but tell us a little bit about what's happening there specifically.
I think France is involved supporting the government there, and they're having some problem with an insurgency. But across the whole Sahel region, which is kind of the where savanna becomes grassland, becomes arid grassland, becomes desert across northern Africa, there is the issue of growing populations competing for good land, whether it's for their herds or for their farms, and we see herders and farmers kind of dividing along Christian Muslim lines. So then you get the religious aspect in there, and you'll see like what we could call religious wars, because then
because some of those people are Christians,
sure.
and then others are Muslims.
Sure.
So there we go.
And so an economic and ethnic conflict takes on a religious aspect to it. But we do see, talking about solutions to this, there are organizations, of course, trying to give aid to people trying to do good. We have the African Union and other international bodies.
The African Union being 55 African countries. It's kind of the Africans' answer to the UN,
right.
that we can take care of our own problems.
Right, trying to bring about political solutions. But then we also see how farmers and herders in the area implementing land restoration practices can literally raise water tables, increase the amount of vegetation available, improve the quality of land, make it so that people can stay and be prosperous in their areas. And we see so much about how we treat the world and how we treat each other are related. And we see that playing out in these vulnerable regions.
So certainly that's another part of the world that we could be praying for, the Sahel region in North Africa, in Mali. Yemen's war, if we move on to Yemen, the UN has deemed that the worst humanitarian disaster in the last few years, and the COVID-19 situation has made the suffering of civilians that have been hit by poverty. Now you get into these extreme lack of food and other diseases in Yemen, and the top humanitarian officials there are warning of famine in Yemen. A year ago, they were trying to make the two sides sit down and have peace talks. That is the Houthi rebels and the government there in Yemen, which is backed by Saudi Arabia. But those talks have fallen apart. Even the UN the peacemaking efforts have hit a brick wall, so they say. Is there any hope for the future of Yemen, or is this just going to be a messy situation? Does this play into the end time? That whole region has a lot of messy sides to it.
Yeah.
What's going to happen in Yemen?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting you've asked, more than once now about the end time, and of course, what we're looking forward to in the end time, what's going to ultimately happen is Jesus will set up a ruler, his rulership over the world, a physical rule, and we're all going to know the Lord. We're all going to have access to his healing and his restorative power over the earth. And so at some point, yes, humanity will hit the time when Jesus himself will have to come back and fix everything. I hope we don't get that bad, but anyhow, specifically about Yemen, it's really sad how the poorest countries in the world are sometimes where you see these conflicts, people driven to the absolute desperation, and
you can see how extremist groups could go in and attract some of these poverty-stricken people. Yes,
they have nothing.
Exactly.
They have nothing, and if they can make $100 a month as a foot soldier in one of these groups, well, that's what they're going to do, and then of course they have to base their lives around it. Their families base their lives around it, and you get these conflicts that seem to go on forever. Now, of course, we know conflicts do end, thankfully. There could be a bright future for Yemen. It's hard to see, though, because who wants to go in and build up Yemen? I mean, what does Yemen have to offer the economies of the world? Not much, really. So it's kind of a sad place where Yemen doesn't have much to offer economically, and so they don't get much in the way of the help that they need, and they become a battleground for these ill-meaning forces to play out their conflicts in.
We did want to talk about the situation, another hot spot, and that is between the United States and Iran, but we're going to save that for its own discussion, which is and then there's a situation that is going on between Russia and Turkey. Those could certainly turn into big-scale conflicts, and everybody's always asking how World War III would start. But before we leave, we just wanted to touch on the situation in Libya, which is also pretty messy, and looking at what happened in Libya. After it all is said and done, will anything be different from what it was like when Gaddafi was in charge? What do we learn? What have we learned from that situation?
Well, I guess they don't have the Gaddafi regime there anymore, and a lot of people were happy to see that go. But of course, along with that, yeah, as you pointed out, now we have instability, lowered life expectancies, lowered standards of living. You know, it's easy sometimes to point fingers at a government and say, well, that's not a godly government, you know, we don't like the way they're doing things. Sometimes these things emerge in an ungodly world kind of as a solution. In place of the solutions of the Bible, we end up with these tough governments that give people some of what they need. And in Libya, we've seen what happens when that was violently taken out of the way and the people are suffering.
I think we need to, perhaps we need to look at some of these situations from a biblical point of view, a Christian perspective, and not as citizens of the country that we live in, but more citizens of God's kingdom. And I don't think we should try to take our form of government or our lifestyle and try to impose them on people who have completely different lifestyle for centuries and try to turn them into little copies of what we are. But I think perhaps the way to go is to try to give them the gospel and present Jesus, and they can take Jesus and apply it to their society and fit it into their society as they see fit.
And we saw, you know, under the Bush administration, they made an attempt to try to normalize things with Libya. Libya made concessions. The United States and the United Kingdom made concessions.
That's right.
And
it looked like we were going in the right direction.
Right. And then, of course, you know, things went very differently after under the Obama administration. Yes. You know, not to say some of these presidents are great and others are bad. You know, they've all done good or bad things. Obama, did some good things on the international level too. But you know, we see how the large countries can treat these smaller countries in a positive way and see good results.
Right. If you have any comments on anything we've said here, we'd like to hear from you. And thank you for watching.